Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today, my guest is going to be Dr. Yusaf Akbar. He is a professor of management at Central European University. He was my professor back when I did my MBA almost more than a decade ago. He's one of the best strategic business people I've ever met, and we talked about a whole bunch of stuff, starting from politics to AI, to businesses, to startup culture. So check it out. Actually, a Hungarian American, one of my friends, Daniel Brownwood. I met him in Budapest when I was there, and we worked together for a couple of years. We grew really close. He's still in touch. He's in Boston now. He's in like this biotech industry, basically, commercial side, like marketing and stuff, like me. And we were talking about this, like social media and stuff. And I was saying that these political parties and these populists are basically manipulating, the system and all that stuff, and getting election fraud and fraud, like, not technically but still. And he was saying, and he had a really interesting take. He was saying that it's not like somebody is pushing a button to, or paying money to, like, Meta or Facebook or something to actually tweak the algorithm in their favor. To It's not how it works. It's just the AI is operating as it usually does. And what the AI does is it kind of, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller until it puts you into a niche box, because then it's more profitable for everybody. And by doing that, all they're doing is just brute forcing the algorithm into thinking that this is what the people of that specific geolocation want. And it just keeps pushing that content more and more and more. And that was interesting, because I feel like he's right. Because, I mean, who gives a shit about Hungary overall, like, globally? I don't think, like, Mark Zuckerberg is sitting in the US somewhere saying, well, I took money and let's manipulate the Hungarian elections. He doesn't care. The AI just does it for him. And it's just this spiral. And the problem is that it's just going to get worse. It's not going to get better ever, because the AI will just continuously refine its own code and refine it based on the amount of data that's coming in. We're at what now? I think we're at like 65 zettabytes of data per year is being generated in the world. So you know how much data that is? If 1 gigabyte was one quarter, then, and if you stack those quarters on top of each other, it'll go to the moon and back 17 times. That's how much 60 zettabytes of data is. And it's being used. It's my only issue there is that it's being weaponized, because the governments are the only, when it comes to just economic feasibility in terms of businesses, they can't invest that much money into that kind of niche targeting. It's just too expensive, right? Because there's no payback there. But governments don't care, because all they're looking for is votes and population control. So they're actually putting, like, federal money into it, which then weaponizes the system. It's almost like military. That money is coming out of, like, military budgets, or intelligence agency budgets. And how do you compete? How do you fight? You can't, because there's a lot of money being funneled into specific AI pushing specific ideas, and it's working. But I don't know. What do you think? How do we combat this?
Well, I can't really speak to the technology, but I can certainly speak to the politics of this. I mean, several of these kinds of new populist movements around the world have tried to kind of rig the system in a way that makes it very hard for oppositions to compete. And let's just use two kind of mini cases here. Let's look at the case of Hungary and the case of Israel. If you look what Netanyahu's far right coalition is trying to do in Israel, it's basically a copy paste of what Viktor Orban did, right? Which was essentially stack the Supreme Court with people that they like, significantly weaken the power of the Supreme Court. I mean, of course there are differences. Israel doesn't have a written constitution. Hungary has a written constitution. But that aside, what's interesting is consent of the population. There's not been a bleep in opposition to Orban in Hungary. Hungarians have just taken it lying down. But you've seen the mass demonstrations in Israel against this attempt, this kind of democratic coup, as it's sometimes called. So, of course, the technology is structural. It makes it incredibly difficult for us to control. But there also is the issue of, does society accept it? Does society allow these people to use this kind of technology? If you think about Netanyahu's political movement, I mean, it's officially Likud, but in so many ways, it's become a cult of personality, right? Because he's been prime minister for so many years now. People like Sheldon Adelson in the US, one of America's largest casino moguls, right, has been financing newspapers in Israel which write uncritical articles about Netanyahu. But again, you saw that, what was it? Almost 10% of the Israeli population were on the streets demonstrating, which forces Netanyahu to kind of say, okay, we'll wait for a month. I mean, it's Pesach right now. It's a very important holy time in Israel. So people are taking time off. But, that's going to come back, that he's going to have to make a decision. And I'm pretty sure that if he tries to go ahead with this, the streets of Israel will be full of people again. Every single time Viktor Orban has reformed the Hungarian constitution, he's received the tacit consent of the people because there's not been mass demonstrations against him.
Why is that though? Like, why would is it a cultural thing? Is it an education issue, or what's the issue there?
It's a great question, Armen. I mean, I think the answer is in several places here. I mean, you've spent some time in this country. I don't know whether you got much of a chance to get outside of Budapest.
Not much, like Balaton, basically, like more like resort area.
You went to Budapest Extended.
Exactly.
If you go to the small towns and villages of this country, most people get their information from the official government television, right? So if you take over television and you control all of the billboards in the country, you as a marketing and advertising exec, I mean, every single billboard in Hungary is controlled by companies allied to the government. So unless you're in certain kind of communities in Budapest where you have access to the web and where you have this kind of slightly disruptive media ecosystem, they're just getting the same story constantly from the government. So I think that's one explanation. I think this kind of city countryside split. More critical voices would say, well, honestly, Viktor Orban is a product of the society that he comes from, and that this consent is actually majority consent, that people don't want foreigners coming to Hungary, and that he's just essentially kind of turned the dial up to 11 to kind of get sort of fear of foreigners. I think last but not least, the opposition here are dreadful. I mean, they're absolutely horrible. I mean, they cannot organize anything serious against the current government. Whereas, again, you saw in Israel, there wasn't any official leadership of this protest, but
Yeah.
the people got out onto the street, right?
Yeah, it was grassroots.
Journalists love to have the face of the opposition, right? They want to be able to interview. There's not a single person who would stand up and say, I am the face of the opposition to the reforms that are taking place. So it's kind of, right?
Absolutely. But here's my thing about like, so is it, I feel like though the sort of subcultures in Hungary that are against the current regime are still a minority. I don't know the numbers, but at least that's what, looking from outside in at this point. At one point I was inside, but right now looking outside in. So it comes to the point where I was looking at, there was an interview, one of Orban's cabinet members was giving an interview to, I think, CNBC or CNN or a little bit more liberal sort of media. And they asked him, about, what's going on with gay rights and LGBTQ communities and these types of questions. And he was saying, listen, if my people don't want that, and I am representing my people, and if they don't want that, then I'm going to enforce not having gay marriage and this and that and this and that. So, and then they're like, and he turned it around and he said, then why are you enforcing your values on me? Who says our values are wrong and yours are right? It's not about right or wrong. It's about, if these people that live in this geographic location in this country want to live a certain way, then they should be allowed to do so. Isn't that sort of the basis of democracy in general? So where is the point where we kind of, as a international community, agree that there should be some sort of intervention into a sovereign nation's policymaking overall, if that point exists in general.
So the first thing I would say, of course, is that this is the typical kind of majoritarian authoritarianism, right? Which is my my legitimacy comes from the majority of the people that don't want a certain kind of thing, right? The consequences of majoritarianism are incredibly dangerous, right? Because that leaves minority groups especially exposed to persecution, right? So the first thing I would say is that I don't think it is a legitimate claim to say that since the majority of a particular society favors a certain course of action, that we should therefore justify that course of action. And we should always have sort of constitutional systems in place which, while allow for the majority of the population to express their views in a fair and democratic way, nevertheless provide protections for different kinds of minorities. I don't want to particularly single out any one in particular.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first thing I say. And the second thing I say is, any country that participates in something like the European Union, which is explicitly a kind of, whether we like it or not, is an explicitly kind of liberal project, right? Liberal internationalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can't have it both ways, right? You can't participate in a liberal internationalist project
and not play by their rules.
And not play by the rules, especially when you're getting 6% of your GDP from EU funds, right?
Absolutely, that makes sense.
And that's the criticism of Hungary, the Hungarian government, I would say, outside of Hungary, which is, you're trying to have it both ways. But I think you're probably right. I suspect the majority of Hungarians are not comfortable with certain kinds of sexual orientation and so on. And I think politicians should be mindful of that fact, right? Mm-hmm. It's not easy to do. I'm sure you pay attention to what goes on in the US, which tends to be the kind of the leading edge of these debates. It's not easy to do at all.
I'll get to the US in a second, but I just want to refer this that you didn't really answer the question though, because it was fair, but you only took Hungary within the unit. My question was, at one point, if there is a point, should the international community actually get involved into a sovereign nation's, internal policy making? Should they or shouldn't they? The EU, I got it, but that's their sure, but that's
the Union has conditioned EU funds on certain practices which are consistent with EU values. I mean, the whole notion that we're not going to release the funds until you do X, Y, Z, is there. I mean, it's a process in place. The European Union doesn't necessarily have anything legislatively to say about society's decisions around the recognition of gender identity. That's not an EU competence, if you like. That's a member state competence. But when it comes to things like corruption, the European Union is very clear on this, which is if you take EU money, you have to take the money and you have to distribute it in a fair and transparent way. And I think that's the thing that has really been sort of taking up a lot of the current Hungarian government's time.
Makes sense.
Is trying to secure the funds. I'm not a liberal interventionist, so I don't believe at all that. Look what happened in Libya, the catastrophe of Libya, right?
Absolutely.
I don't believe that the world should be imposing its liberal views on sovereign countries, because not because necessarily it's a bad idea in principle, but in practice it's always a bad idea.
Absolutely. It's also anti-democratic in some point. So this is where democracy, I always remember, like in these times especially, I have this flashback of like Churchill's words where he said, democracy is the worst system except for the rest. And I keep kind of being reminded of that. So here's my view on democracy as a general, and I'd like to hear what you think. So for me, when they say, oh, this country is democratic and this country isn't, for example, right? So for me, democracy in itself is not it's not a black and white. It's not yes or no. For me, democracy is like epsilon. It's almost a movement where you're constantly striving to be more democratic. And as long as you're constantly striving to be more democratic, I would consider you a democratic country. Because ranking the countries taking the Arab world and comparing it to EU or the US, it's just not it's not the same. It's apples and oranges. You can't compare. So you can only compare you to you, so the country to itself. And as long as there's a movement that you are more democratic as you're going along, and you're never going to get there. There's no 100% democratic country. It's not going to exist. But as long as you're going towards becoming more democratic compared to yourself, then I would consider you a democratic country on some level, and that's the way I see it. And comparing the countries for me is the biggest no. Every country has to compare to itself. At least that's the way I see it. I understand if you're a member of the EU and that's the rules that you want. That's you agree to those rules when you enter it. Fair enough. But overall, I think this is what the way I see. I mean, how do you see democracy? How broken is democracy really?
Well, that's several questions. Let me just sort of let me just make the following argument. The notion of national sovereignty, right? The notion that that within a particular kind of geographical, officially recognized space, that a state has the right to defend its territory, is deeply rooted in many countries' psyche, right? I don't want to get into the issues facing Armenia and neighboring Azerbaijan. I mean, I just don't want to get into it, but that's an obvious case in point, right?
Oh, there's multiple, the Kosovo and Yugoslavia, and
yeah,
etc.
I mean, sort
There's
of,
a lot.
These kind of post-conflict frozen conflicts, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you look at the case, of several Central European countries right now who are member states of the European Union, you think of Poland and Hungary as the kind of the most obvious examples, but you can also look at other countries who tell a similar story, depending on who's running the country at the time. There's always a trade-off between national sovereignty and democracy, because as you'll know, when there's a state of emergency in any particular country, as we saw during COVID, for example, democracy takes a back seat, right? And the Hungarian government has argued that migration is a national emergency for Hungary.
Mm-hmm.
So the defense of Hungary's borders takes precedence over other objectives. Right now, there can be a debate about whether or not this is a real threat to Hungary, but that's how it's framed. It's framed as a question of national sovereignty versus, uncontrolled migration, and a fear, shall we say, that a multicultural society is a bad thing for Hungary, which is a fairly monocultural place. I mean, obviously you have significant minority groups, obviously Roma being the obvious ones, but you also have other minorities, Jewish minority, for example, in Hungary.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a fairly mono-ethnic society, which, if there's too much, quote unquote, multiculturalism, could be threatened. And then there's also the empirical factors. There's really only one or two countries in the world, or maybe three countries in the world, that have succeeded in developing a multicultural democracy, right? The
For
United
example,
States is the most obvious
US.
example, right?
Mm-hmm.
The UK is not bad at it, right? Maybe the Netherlands succeeds. But these are exceptions to the rule. Most countries don't succeed at building multi-ethnic democracies. I mean, you can have societies which are multi-ethnic, but not necessarily democratic with the small d. I mean, you think about a place like United Arab Emirates, which is one of the most diverse places on earth, a very tolerant place, by the way. But obviously, it's not governed in a traditional multi-party democracy way. It's governed through a kind of centralized, benevolent authority. And I have to say, traveling extensively to the UAE, I find it way more tolerant in many ways than parts of Western Europe and the United States.
Absolutely. I think one of the arguments that usually comes up when we're talking about multicultural societies is that there's a safety issue. The more like a monochromatic and the same that we are, we usually don't fight because there's a societal pressure to be like Japan is a great example of that, or Korea. They're they're just so similar to each other that nobody steals because you're part of the same society. Whereas, but I think UAE is a great example. It's one of the safest places on earth. On earth. I mean, it was for me, it was mind blowing. Like when I went to, I had some business there, so I used to travel a lot to Dubai, and we went to the beach, and we all wanted to go into the water with like a big group. And I'm like, well, where do I leave my wallet? Like, I'll stay behind, you guys go. And then because that's what you would
Well,
usually
that's
do,
the obvious
somebody
thing you
stays behind.
do, right?
They're like, no, no, just leave your wallet, like cash, phone, like don't worry, nobody's gonna touch anything at all. And I was blown away. We left it, and everything was fine. So yeah, I definitely agree. But on the other hand, that needs to be financed heavily, which they can. And there's a big cost side of keeping that kind of benevolent sort of governmental structure. Not all countries can do that just in terms of pure finance. Having only 400, 500,000 of your local population, it's just not enough of a market to have that kind of economy to sustain that kind of model. They have
But it also speaks to the tolerance of Emiratis, the fact that they're willing to tolerate the fact
They're
that they
super
are a
tolerant.
minority in their own country,
Absolutely, absolutely.
right?
I agree.
Which is not a common characteristic around the world, right?
No, they're very, very forward thinking. They're very visionary for sure. So they have that sort of eye on the future type of thing. They have a minister of AI, and that's already for me. They had it for a while now, even before like this Chat GPT buzz. They have that for a while, and I think that's very, very forward thinking. So I completely agree. So I want to ask you a question about the U.S. We talked about the U.S. and you brought the U.S. as an example of democracy, but here's where it gets really weird for me. Trump he went to New York. It was 34 felony counts now.
Mm-hmm.
That so they want to put him in prison, and for me that's very weird. Coming from I'm from the U.S., but obviously I've lived in Eastern Europe a lot, so I can I have a lot of background. So it's really weird because it just seems like it's politically motivated, and for at least for me, it's obvious that it's politically motivated because every single president has done something wrong. Why is he the only one being persecuted? I mean, if anybody has to go to prison, I would argue it's probably Bush Jr., if not Bush Sr., but Bush Jr. for sure. Um, killing 5 million Iraqis with no weapons of mass destruction. There's so many things that you can pull up. But there's never been that case because there's always a peaceful transition of power. And I think that's what the key for the US system is that nobody, so okay, everybody makes mistakes. We got it. Even if you did something that's maybe not, completely, because it's all gray. Obama gave a great interview and they asked him, how do you, these decisions, he's like, listen, if a decision comes to my table, it's 50-50, or else it won't come to my table. Any decision that's 60-40 just doesn't come to the president's table. It's all 50-50. So all presidents are making 50-50 decisions throughout. And in those 50-50 decisions, there's always a case where you could argue probably some sort of felonious action or something that's not maybe technically in the complete white, maybe grayish or whatever it might be. So all of these, but they always say, you know what, peaceful transition of power. You don't touch, because if you touch the guy before you, the next guy is going to touch you. And it's just going to go on. And this is the cycle we see in all Eastern European countries and all countries that are from, it's usually the case. Whoever comes after Orban is going to have a bone to pick because that's what's going to happen. And then the other guy, and then the other guy. And I feel like they broke that with going after Trump. I feel like even if he did what they say he's accused of, going after him just sets a very bad precedent overall for the U.S. as a country going forward. So from that perspective, is it really democratic then? If this is actually politically motivated, then they're no better than any other country basically in Eastern Europe. What do you think?
So I mean, there's an obvious risk of whataboutery here. I mean, I never supported the Iraq War.
Sure.
Even when it wasn't fashionable to do so, because I knew there were no weapons of mass destruction. It was just a concocted story to pursue a certain foreign policy action, right?
Absolutely. And hundreds of thousands of people died because of that decision.
I anything between 150 to 1 million people, depending on whichever source you look at. But again, I think, if one is being entirely sort of clear-eyed about this, I think there's one thing to go abroad and commit crimes. There's another thing to commit crimes at home.
But yeah, you're very thin line.
And I suspect that Trump's biggest mistake is that he's committed crimes at home. I mean, this is a twice impeached president, right? The way the Constitution is set up, to get 2/3 of the Senate to condemn the president in a trial is a very, very high threshold, and it's never really been achieved, right, since the creation of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And by definition, any attempt to prosecute a prominent politician is a political act, by definition.
I don't think so.
So what?
I don't
hear
agree.
me out. Let me explain why I think that is. I mean,
okay.
The peaceful transfer of power has been predicated on the notion that the predecessor to whom transfer is taken from has not violated the norms of the US political system. I mean, that's why Nixon had to resign. You're too young for this, Armen, but the reason Nixon had to resign was not because he was
but he was then given a pardon
in a trial in the Senate. It was because senators came to him and said, "Listen,
you need to go.
If it comes to us, we can't protect you."
Absolutely, but he was given a pardon.
But that's the point. That's the norm, right? He walks away and says, "Okay, fine. The game is up. I'm going to walk away. I'm going to spend the rest of my life in shame, and I'll always be remembered as the only president in U.S. history in the modern era that's had to resign," right?
Sure.
That's the norm. Trump has not respected those norms. He didn't accept his defeat in the election. He directly or indirectly promoted an act of sedition on the day of the counting of the Electoral College votes.
Okay.
So we can argue till we're blue in the face about whether or not George W. Bush should be held accountable for war crimes, or Obama, or whoever. That's a dead-end argument, because that's not the job of the US Constitution. That's the job of an international criminal court. The job of the US Constitution is to guarantee the laws and norms of the country, and it's abundantly clear that Donald Trump has violated many of those norms. And that's the reason why the law is now taking its course against Donald Trump, and it's a political decision to do so.
Sure. It's just the political part when that comes into play, especially when you're in a pre-election year. So let's just be very clear. I'm not Republican or Democrat. I think all politicians are dirty regardless. So I'm kind of out of the political spectrum. It wasn't like, it's not like Joe Biden's any better, but more or less. So I really don't care about who it is. My only worry is the systematic approach. The US always had a systematic approach. And that's one of the things that was, the institutions that are awesome. No, it's not, because I feel like they set the rules of the game, and then somebody came and beat them at their own game. And now they're pissed off about that.
No, Donald Trump violated the norms and practices of the US Constitution, which require a peaceful transfer of power.
That part I agree. But that's the unwritten rule. In terms of just the law, in terms of laws of democracy, he did what he wanted to do. He can talk if he wants.
Yeah,
that's his right.
I would characterize that as a sort of an overly narrow definition of constitutional law. A lot of constitutional law is not written down. It resides in norms and practices.
Mm-hmm.
And there is nothing in the US Constitution which talks about a peaceful transfer of power.
Sure.
There's a process which describes how the Electoral College decides who becomes president, but there's nothing that says the president is expected to vacate the White House at this time on this day. There's an expectation that the president of the United States does that.
Mm-hmm.
And the strength, I think, of liberal democracies that survive are ones that where the norms are almost as important, if not more important, than the written rules.
Fair enough. The spirit of the law.
Yeah. And I think that Donald Trump, for whatever reason, neither respects or understands that notion. Again, that doesn't excuse previous presidents from actions that they've taken which have had catastrophic consequences for other parts of the world. I'm just saying we can't use the US Constitution as the vehicle for adjudicating those actions. Those actions can only be considered in an international context.
Sure, because it was done outside of the US.
And the US refuses to actually participate in the International Criminal Court, even though the US is one of the architects of the International Criminal Court itself, right? So again, that speaks to national sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
So it's okay to have an International Criminal Court as long as that International Criminal Court doesn't limit our national sovereignty.
Fair enough. So let's get off this political topic. I mean, this is like a dead end in any case. But I think one of the things that I keep reading in your sort of LinkedIn posts and everything is this startup ecosystem, culture, and you like to bash on it. I'm a lot of the things that you write, I tend to agree with, to be honest. Although I own a startup, but I'll get to like why I think we're different and how I believe in what you're saying and a lot of the things that you're saying. But overall, one of the things that I wanted to talk about is this this betting on the future sort of idea, because that's what a startup is. What's the difference between a startup and a business? The only difference is that the big difference is that startups are betting on the future. Businesses are trying to achieve, profits and cash flow positivity and etc. and margins. Whereas startup is just, they're spending much more than they're making just because they're betting that in the future at some point this will grow and it'll come back and it'll grow and it'll come back. And then you're betting on the future and betting on the future. And then, so one VC round, second VC round, third VC round just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And you continue betting on the future until at some point either it just implodes and goes nowhere, or they just go IPO like Uber, and then they just change the management and then try to become more lean and actually cash flow positive and actually make some money. So within this idea, what's the biggest problem in your opinion? I mean, what's your biggest pet peeve of this whole startup bro culture?
Silent. I can't hear you, Armen.
And the key there is that what's your biggest pet peeve? I mean, why are you so adamant about the startups ecosystem and structure being wrong, or as you put it, economically illiterate? I do want to ask you about the first one. Why isn't it good for countries? Because that's usually they say, if you're smaller and you're landlocked and you don't have any resources, then this is probably your best bet in terms of just economic growth. But you feel the opposite?
It's going to be around 60, 70 billion probably. Next up, it's going to be what? I'm guessing the UK, because of the City of London, you're going to have, 30, 40 billion. India, because of the large family businesses now and the rapid growth. So, you get outside of a handful of countries, and this whole notion of startup financing is just a joke. It just doesn't exist. There's no money for it. So why are we wasting our time encouraging sort of economic activities which are never going to be rentable because there's no money to finance them? So that's essentially my argument. It's cosplay startup essentially outside of a handful of countries.
Well, there's this idea that startups want to be unicorns, right? That's sort of like the buzzword. And what's a unicorn? It's $1 billion valuation company that's privately held, right? It's very straightforward. But there's this new sort of, it existed for a while, but it's catching on more now, called the zebra. Have you heard of this?
Yeah, I've heard of the zebra, yeah.
Okay, so what do you think about the zebra then?
It's equally fallacious as the unicorn. I mean, the thing about the unicorn, of course, is they don't actually exist, which is the irony of this.
Absolutely.
You have a bunch of cosplayers talking about unicorns, without having the self-reflection to understand that actually unicorns don't exist. I'm not saying you can't get billion-dollar valuations in Silicon Valley or in China, increasingly in India, in the UK. I'm sure you can, but this is not relevant for the vast majority of people on planet Earth. That's my argument. And the zebra notion, again, I mean, the numbers just don't add up.
I when we were talking, I called this the Silicon Valley circle jerk. Everybody puts money into everybody else. Everybody just kind of goes around, and the money's just flowing in like a circle. But there is an argument, and I agree that there's a lot of startups out there that are just basically just funding within this network of people are just kind of, but there are startups that break through that and actually deliver real world value, and people actually really use it on a daily basis. I mean,
Can you give me an example of a globally scaled startup that does something useful is very subjective, so we might have difficulty getting agreement on that, but like does something globally scaled that has had a real impact outside of the handful of these countries that we've mentioned?
Uber, Zoom.
Uber's American.
Sure.
Zoom's American.
Sure.
Outside of a handful of these exceptional places, give me the name of.
Well, when you say America, see, here's okay.
This.
Let me tell you the problem with that. Okay, so you're right, because that's where the capital flow is. That's where the money is. So ultimately, when you say it's an American company. That's right, but it's not necessarily American founded. So even if you're living in Budapest, for example, and there's three super smart like engineer Hungarians, and they want to open a company and a startup, and they realize that at some point they're going to require some sort of investment into the startup, they have to found the company in the US or London.
How many Hungarian engineers have been able to do that?
I don't know the numbers for Hungarian engineers.
Yeah.
I know that there are
one. The only Hungarian that was able to break out of this pointless, meaningless nonsense was the guy who was one of the co-founders of Spotify.
Yeah.
And why? Because he wasn't in Hungary when the company was started. It was in Sweden.
Yeah.
And I remember, I don't know whether you were still in the program at that time, Armen, but we brought this guy in to talk at the business school. And I was just like, this guy is as Hungarian as I am. Like, it's just so. This is my point, Armen. Like, we should not be wasting our time giving the impression to electrical engineers from Budapest, or anywhere for that matter, outside of a handful of countries, that they stand a chance of success. They do not. It's not an opinion, it's just counting. And there are opportunity costs here in encouraging people to do this cosplay, which is they could be doing something else which is probably more valuable for their society. That's a major criticism of this whole nonsense.
I get it. But if let's assume, so here's the difference between all of that and us at Hexact, so the company I founded. And I just want to give you like a little bit of our numbers so that you can kind of feel out where we are. So in terms of what we're doing in terms of the financials and strategically, we want to be cash flow positive by the end of this year, and we'll probably be cash flow positive around June-ish. So in a couple of months, we're already cash flow positive. So we've been bootstrapped all the way. So from day one till now, we spent whatever we could generate for sales. We've been a revenue company for years now. So, but here's the problem with that. And we call ourselves Zebra, not Unicorn. So we have within us, we might have a little like anti-startup culture as well, just because that's how we think. The founders, the team that we have here, like the 4 or 5 founders together, we're all of us had our own business, and all of us had multiple businesses and exits and failures and etc. But we have a business mindset, and then we have like a guy that's on the board, and he's very like the down to earth kind of guy. He's like, listen, show me the cash, show me the money. Like Jerry Maguire, I don't know what you're talking about. Show me the money. How are we paying payroll in 3 months? So I just need to know where the money's coming from. And it can't just be investments. But the problem is when you think about it that way, then they don't invest. Then it's very difficult for VCs to invest, because VCs want to hear, when they asked me how much, what's your expectation of revenue for next year, I said, well, we're going to 3x. We've been doubling our revenue year on year for the past 3 years. If we get investments, we can triple it instead of double it. We can double it without investments because we've been doing that. We know how to do that. But we can triple it if we get investments. They're like, well, triple, I need like 10x, 20. And I look at these other startups that are pitching. They're like, well, we're going to hit $500 million revenue in 3 years. I'm like, there's no way I don't see how you're going to do that. And I feel like I don't even want to promise that because I know I can't do it. I can do maybe 20 million in 3 years. And that's sort of where I'm coming from. But then I'm not getting the investment. So I'm almost forced into pushing up those numbers. And I feel like we're kind of missing out on some level. I'm very comfortable because we're cash flow positive almost. So my risk is quite minimal now. I don't really need the investment. But if the investment comes, we can definitely accelerate the growth. That's for sure. So all of the money that's coming in, investment, won't be given to like payroll, but it'll actually be going into marketing and commercials. And so actual growth, or we're banking on the growth. I don't need the money to pay payroll because I'm cash flow positive. So I feel like this kind of system where we are in should be what's taught at business schools or what the electrical engineer in Hungary could achieve.
Exactly. So we agree. You're running a small business.
Yes and no.
You're
because I still think VCs will give you money.
Using basic business principles, which is behind the success of the German Austrian Mittelstand, behind the success of the Italian SME sector. It makes sense. It's grounded in reality.
Sure, but I still want VC money at some point for growth.
Okay, so if you still want to hang on to this cosplay notion, then that's fine. But
why is it cosplay then?
It seems to me that you are doing exactly what a small business should do.
But why is it cosplay then? That's my point. Like, why shouldn't I?
It's not real because it's not going to happen.
Why isn't it real?
Because it's not going to happen.
Of course it will. If you're cash flow positive, everybody wants to give you money.
I would say that that's a generalization that's contingent upon a number of factors.
Sure. But I mean, it just becomes so much easier.
Bear in mind now for the first time since 2008, people with money have alternatives, fixed income, bonds, and so on. And so I'm not going to comment on the quality of your business. I have no doubt that it's a great business. But many of these companies that are kind of, jonesing for VC funding are going to find that there's no money around because basically high net worth individuals are putting their money into more safer asset classes because interest rates are now rising.
Yeah, super.
So why should we waste our time with these stupid pretend 20x growth pitches in 30 seconds with silly slides? Let's actually just do number crunching here and let's put our money in Euro bonds or in US Treasury bonds.
So let me give you a statistic I was reading yesterday for this, and I as soon as I read the article, I knew you would love this, and I wanted to bring it up, and I really like it as well. So they did a survey of startup founders, and they asked the question was about the burn rate versus cash coming in, so sales. And a lot of them, it's 1x, 2x, 3x, 4x, 5x, basically. So you're burning as much as you're making. That's 1x. That's where we are, kind of. And then 2x, you're burning 2 times more, 3x and 4. So you're just basically burning investor capital, right? And when they asked these questions, the awesome thing was all of the companies that were at 5x, and a lot of them were at 5x. So like $1 million is coming in, but they're burning $5 million a year because of that, flow. They asked, what is your expectation for next year? And they said a lot of them were pushing towards 3x. So the 1x and the 2x were pushing towards 3x, and the 4 and 5 were coming down. So it seems like there's a consensus that more or less 3x is now acceptable. But here's the awesome thing. The second statistic on the same questionnaire, on the same format was, has your expectation of growth changed in the past 3 years? And the majority is no, which basically means whoever was burning 5x and is now happy to burn 3x, that 2x difference was bullshit. They were burning it for no reason whatsoever. And investors know this. So I guess the discussion between investors and startups were, well, dude, why are you burning 5x? You should be burning 1x. You lied. And they're like, you know what? We did lie. How about we just, you know what? We'll split the difference. Let's just do 3x. And everybody said okay and went home.
So, look, I mean, you use this term burn rate.
Yeah.
Now, burn rate is a euphemism. Let me rephrase it. My costs are 5 times higher than my revenues.
Yeah.
If I put it like that, it's nuts.
But it's not
completely nuts.
Because it's not CapEx. That's why. I mean, ultimately, this is investment, right?
Because the only reason one is able to get 5 times cost over revenue is because investors have no other place to put their money. Now they have another place to put their money. The true test of an idea becomes relevant, because people are only going to give you money if they're confident that they will do better than if they park their money in a relatively safe place. And this is fine. And this is where so much of this nonsense is basically, running aground. And you've seen it. The layoffs in Silicon Valley are ridiculous at the moment, right?
Sure.
So, for me, we should be teaching small business principles to people rather than cosplay startup in most parts of the world. And in those places in the world where there is venture capital, the changing momentum around fixed income and other assets are now beginning to expose a lot of this startup nonsense as basically being frivolous and pointless. I'll give you a little example. Someone I respect greatly, a colleague of mine, announced on LinkedIn the other day that he's proud to be an investor in a startup. I mean, it's hilarious. It's a startup that is basically a digital platform which brings together domestic cleaners and people that want to have their house cleaned. So basically, it's just a digital phone book. Do we really need to be investing in stuff like that?
Well, one of the biggest companies in the world, the unicorn, Service Titan, basically does that for plumbers and electricians and etc.
So it's already out there.
I don't know if they do cleaners, to be honest, but it's massive. It's like 4 billion, 3 point something billion or something, the valuation. So it's
valuation, but is it actually making any money?
Absolutely.
Okay, I'll take your word for it. If it's making, we already have something out there, so let's not waste our time creating something different. But that's my point. And of course, I clicked on the link, and there was this website, and of course, guess what it was? The founders standing in t-shirts on the roof with the distance behind them. All of the cosplay nonsense associated with startup. It was almost like copy paste. You couldn't make this stuff up. And I'm like, we really don't need somebody to put a digital platform together to find out where I can find a cleaner. I can do that myself. This is an absolute utter waste of time. Now, if my colleague, who I respect, wants to waste their money on this completely pointless activity, have at it. But I'm not going to tell people that their professional future should be in the business of creating a platform like that.
Fair enough. Fair enough. But see, the issue there is also that, so the idea then is, if I have a small business, an enterprise, and I run it like a small business and enterprise, then if I'm awesome and I manage great and everything and it goes smoothly, then my kids have a chance of being in the upper middle class, if I'm middle class, right? And then if they run it perfectly for their life, and then their kids might have a chance of being in the wealthy class, for example. But then you get these startups, and he's 28 and he's making millions of dollars. So why wouldn't somebody that has the engineering capacity and the IQ to actually do something like that, to do it? The cosplay part, I understand, but again, it's just part of the rules of engagement. It's like when anybody comes from the countryside to Budapest to study, they almost have to work twice as hard to create the same amount of success, because the people that are already in Budapest, the students that are already living in, their parents know each other and they know each other. It's a clique, and you're not part of the club. You're coming from outside into the club. So you have to work twice as hard. I get that. But you still have to adhere to the rules of the club.
Yeah. So what's the Armenian word for startup?
There is no Armenian word for startup.
Okay. There's no Hungarian word for startup. There's no German word for startup. There's no French word for startup. There's no Japanese word for startup. There's no Korean word for startup. There's no Arabic word for startup. What does that tell you? It tells you that in these societies, the notion is irrelevant. Because if it was relevant, it would already be in the language. And it's the same in Vienna. It's the same in Vienna. I see this all the time. Der Startup. Ja, der Startup ecosystem. This is a waste of time. Look at Austria's best businesses. None of them are startups. They're these very, very carefully positioned specialist mid-sized firms that are the only company in the world that does a particular thing. And they're the leading company in the world for that. That's the future for most countries. It's not all of this pretend startup stuff.
I feel like I agree on a lot of levels, but they're also, I feel like it's not necessarily either you're a business or a startup. I feel like there's room in the middle.
So I think the notion of startup brings with it a series of kind of implicit and explicit values.
For example,
there's the whole tech bro culture, which if you want we can also talk about. But I think there's this fairly sort of bland, repetitive set of practices around der Startup, le Startup, il Startup. I can't say it in Japanese. I can't say it in Korean. And it's just the same old, same old. You get up on a stage, you've got a pair of skinny blue jeans, white sneakers, maybe a white shirt, collared shirt. You have a little microphone like this, and you have 6 slides. You start out with a personal anecdote. I mean, it's just like, God, do me a favor. This is so dull. It's so uninventive. It's so uncreative. It's so cookie cutter.
That part I understand. Like in terms of the culture part, I'm all for that. All I'm saying is if you're a enterprise, a company, not a startup, like an actual company, you're striving for profit, cash flow positivity, etc. And you're also in the process of growing, and you're growing at a very organic and steady rate, right? But there's a point where you already know where to drill for oil. You already are able to drill and actually get oil. So there is demand. You know that there's demand. There's proof of concept. And money is already coming in from those drilled holes. You just want to expand those because you need money to actually go faster. And at that point, you need investment. So that is where this sort of enterprise business part hits that startup world. How do I get investment then?
A slight diversion, but I think it's still relevant. So I want to say 6 years ago, when we were still based 7 or 8 years ago now, maybe even a decade, when we were still in Budapest before Orban kicked us out and sent us to Vienna, right?
Mm-hmm.
We used to have this visiting group of students from NYU. I don't know whether you participated in any of those things at all when you were in the program. And I would generally run it because I think I was probably the best face for this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so I would run it. And of course, I would ask various colleagues to sort of come and give guest presentations. I do a couple myself. But I remember we brought in a colleague who teaches entrepreneurship, and they brought in a guest speaker, and of course, guess what? The NYU students are Googling who this person is, right?
Of course,
on their computer in front of them, and sort of 10 minutes into the talk, I was sitting next to one of the NYU students, and they said, "Professor, look at this on the screen," and it had the story of this individual. So this individual became the head of one of Hungary's venture capital funds. This individual had to Deutsche Telekom had to pay an out-of-court settlement to the U.S. government for violations of the Corrupt Practices Act, because basically Deutsche Telekom, which owns Magyar Telekom, which then tried to acquire Montenegrin Telekom. This guy, when they were CEO of Magyar Telekom, had paid bribes to actually basically get the deal in the privatization deal. So here we have this corrupt person standing up in front of a group of MBA students from NYU talking about venture capital in Hungary. For me, that epitomizes what venture capital is outside of these 5 or 6 places that we've mentioned. A joke. A complete and utter joke.
And you think the collapse of I don't know how much you know about the collapse of SVB, the bank.
Yeah, I followed it quite closely. Yeah.
Yeah. So then the argument is that because these VC sort of fundings are jokes, then SVB was inevitable that was going to collapse because the majority of their asset base are venture capital firms, right? The portfolio.
So the collapse of SVB is complicated. And it has multiple stages to it, right? So if we work backwards from the collapse, the run on the bank is caused by a handful of large venture capitalists sharing messages on Signal or to say, "I'm taking my money out," right?
Yeah.
So it becomes inevitable when Peter Thiel and his cronies take their money out of the bank. You go a step further back. They didn't have a risk officer at the bank for 6 months.
That's right.
You go another step back and you look at the quality of their balance sheet, and you see that they've bought a lot of long-term
bonds
because they have to buy long-term because they can't get a coupon rate which justifies the investment.
That's right.
You've got bad what's the word? You've got bad financial management practices. And then you've got the more nefarious thing, which is the bank wasn't just lending money to the startups. The bank was lending money in the form of personal loans to founders of the startups. You've also got the potential for financial crime. And, a couple of cases have already been brought have been filed already. So if you look at the failure of SVB, there are a number of reasons why it fails, right?
Sure, but I would all of that for me is just mismanagement. It's the manager's problem. They made a mistake.
Yeah, but it's a feature, not a bug.
Absolutely, but they made the mistake over and over and over and over again, and they're going to continue making those mistakes.
But why did these startup guys leave their money in a bank that didn't have a risk officer for 6 months?
Good question.
Well, that's an obvious question, because if I'm such a friggin' genius like Peter Thiel, and I know that they don't have a risk officer, what am I going to do?
Yeah.
I'm either going to get a risk officer in there, or I'm going to pull my money out, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So SVB is now owned by First Citizens, I think it's called, from North Carolina. And their bank is very conservative, family owned, right? Railroads and infrastructure investments, that kind of thing. So it makes sense for them on some level. They get a cut. It's a very discounted rate, obviously, and they diversify their portfolio. But do you think they should keep it as a subsidiary, like let SVB just be, or should they just pull it into the family? Because I feel like, at least in terms of the team and the people and the mindset of going from venture capital funding to conservative North Carolina railroad funding is not going to be an easy move.
The probability of success is very low.
In any case, I agree. I say, like, if they keep it as a subsidiary, it's playing with fire, because if I talk to the SVB guys, I'm like, well, you guys, bet on stuff and you made mistakes, and now you just want more money from the North Carolina guys to bet more. So no, you cannot be a subsidiary. You have to become part of their group so that they have control over your risk instead of you controlling your risk. And it's not just the person, the human being. Like, they can always put a risk officer, sure, but that's not going to be good enough. You need to change your culture. And to change the culture, then you got to kind of merge into these guys' culture, and somewhere in between is probably the right way to go. But I feel like if it was, we were lucky. We pulled out our money way before the collapse happened, and when it wasn't a big deal, but we saw it coming. It was obvious that the stock price just started plummeting, and steel and all that stuff happened, and I just feel like it's history repeating itself, and it's just going to happen over and over and over and over again. So this is where I feel like European countries are more stable in that sense, because the government's more involved. You have much stricter regulations in terms of governmental control. The federal, the central banks of European governments and countries are much more rigorous, and it's much harder to get all those risks and licensing and all that. But then again, I say that, and then Credit Suisse goes to shit. So it's not, I'm not. So I'm like, well, it does not necessarily work. What happened with Credit Suisse then? Why did that? It just kind of.
Credit Suisse's problems have been long identified, because Credit Suisse is above a certain size. So under European banking supervision rules, it has to undergo routine stress tests to kind of see what happens, right?
Sure.
One of the reasons why SVB wasn't subject to US stress tests was because the Republicans in Congress increased the threshold from $50 billion to $250 billion, right? And of course, SVB was below the $250 billion threshold, so there were no mandatory stress tests. So anyway, so everyone has known for a very long time that Credit Suisse was in trouble, and that the quality of their balance sheet was poor. I think Credit Suisse was collateral damage as a consequence of what happened at SVB. And ironically, a couple of years before, the UBS and Credit Suisse wanted to merge, and the Swiss government said, there's no way we're going to allow you to become a monopoly retail bank for the whole of Switzerland. And now, of course...
How fast did that deal go through? 48 hours, 72 hours? That was the fastest deal I've ever seen in my life. Ever. In Europe especially, just jammed the deal through, basically. That was very fast.
Yeah, the Swiss federal government argued, of course, that it's not a merger, it's a takeover. So it's not quite the same thing. But I don't think we should necessarily draw too many parallels between what was happening at Credit Suisse, what was happening at Silicon Valley Bank. I think that they're part of the same story, just because there was this panic that broke out in the financial markets. And then, of course, those super annoying people like Nouriel Roubini, who goes on TV and predicts the arrival of Sauron from Lord of the Rings. Why anyone listens to this guy anymore, God only knows, because he has nothing positive to say. He will always tell you the world is about to collapse. So I guess from an entertainment perspective, if you want to have him on just to tell you that the world's about to collapse, invite him on. But he hasn't been right about something in years, because his entire...
But it only takes one, no? It only takes one. If I say the world is going to collapse next year, every single year, and at one point it collapses, then I'm a prophet.
The clock is right 2 times a day.
2 times a day. Awesome. Yusaf, thank you very much for your time. I know you got to run to another meeting, but this was great. And overall, just like shooting the shit with you is always fun, and I really, really enjoyed it. So thank you very, very much for coming on.
Pleasure. And always happy to come back and do it again if necessary.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Yusaf. Be in touch. Just send me over the recordings whenever you have time.
Okay, super. Take care.
Right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.